Okay, so I have to acknowledge that sometimes these conversations are a little less about exploring who I am explicitly with that intention from the start, and more about just telling you who I am, or I'm excited about realizing that there are uh, words to assist in helping you describe who I am. In doing that, though, I automatically am still exploring who I am, or um, having an opportunity to reflect on who I am or what I think I am, or these things that I have gathered that support these things about me that I like or dislike or whatever. But I know the presentation is more of like, oh, I found all these things and this is about me and whatever. Something that I was actually wanting to talk about, I don't know when the idea came into my head, a couple days ago, if not earlier, about being a romantic, quote unquote, with the and what that means to me. Um, However, I did a little research just on furthering my understanding of that, if you want to call it historical time in which that movement, art movement, and other things, those ideals and stuff came to bear when they were kind of being born. And so in doing that research, I found a lot of things that I was like, yeah, that supports exactly kind of how I live on a day-to-day basis, and it was a good thing. But yeah, so I wrote a lot of that stuff down. Before that, though, I was thinking about having this conversation because I was like, oh, I just have realized some things in the past couple of weeks of just like, this is such a huge part of who I am. And it's weird to talk about because of that word it just has a lot of associations with it, right? I'm talking about being a romantic in the sense that someone would have used that term a long time ago to describe someone who is like, if we were thinking of the Enlightenment, and we'd be like, oh, that is an enlightened person, or they believe in enlightenment, or being a romantic is someone who would believe in the ideals of romance and of the romantic movement. And I feel like I was using that phrase for myself without fully ever understanding it in that context. And it still applied, and I feel like it still applies in the ways that I was using it, before I really had this fuller understanding of the ideals that it really encapsulates and expresses. So, some baggage with that word is that saying to someone or expressing to someone that I am a romantic, depending on the context and who you're talking to and whatever, it's just going to garner an eye roll. Or just that you think really highly of yourself or something. And that's the thing, is that some people don't think that that is something to idealize at all. And I completely understand why to a degree. However, in some ways it just feels like that's how I'm built. There's a lot of nature and nurture there, but I feel like there's a lot of nature with me and being this way. And I have nurtured myself into this as well, further than what it naturally was to begin with, or what was naturally there, perhaps waiting to be nurtured in or out of me. And yeah, so there's baggage with the word of being like, oh wow, you really think that of yourself, or you were this romantic person, or what does that mean? And people have a lot of preconceived, no, I shouldn't say preconceived notions or definitions or labels. I mean, but people have an idea of what that word means in certain contexts, and a lot of it is tied to romantic love and love between partners and what it means to be romantic in a relationship like that and whatever else. And that's how I think when people are interpreting it in that context, it definitely can get a reaction of just like, okay, like that's really whatever, that you would want to describe yourself that way, or I don't know. I wish I had a proper word. I mean, a lot of this is about words right now, and I don't have a proper word to describe what I'm thinking of when people are just like, wow, you really are tooting your own horn, or you really think a lot of yourself, or whatever. But in this other context, it's something that this way of being, I guess, permeates life for some people, and I feel like this is like getting so much in my nature, and something that I perpetuate, that it reaches so many different areas of my life. So I'm going to start off with just, well, not start off, that is the start. I'm going to continue by discussing these things. So these are just like quotes and definitions and things that aid in discussing the topic of romanticism and being a romantic. Characterized by its emphasis on emotion and individualism, as well as glorification of all the past and nature. Now, there's some pros and cons here. So I really feel like that was something I pulled away, that I was like, man, this is like defining the romantic movement, but also really defining how I tend to operate. So emphasis on emotion, I like to balance that with logic and reasoning for sure. I try, and part of my nature is to be very focused on planning and scheduling and using logic and reason in tandem with, organizing my life. However, I'm a very emotional person as well, and I don't know where that kind of ratio is and how it balances, and obviously there's different contexts and scenarios in which something trumps the other thing, but that is definitely a thing. Emphasis on emotion is something that, when I'm talking about art, I definitely emphasize emotion over anything logical and rational in the concept of the work, I guess. And then it says emphasis on individualism, and I completely have that. I definitely feel like this is why I feel like, oh man, like why sometimes artists get a reputation for being so pretentious and stuff, is that if they are along these, I mean, some of them just are, for sure, but some people might just have this emphasis on the individual in exploring yourself and learning more about yourself and wanting to express yourself because you feel like you have something worth expressing, or you believe in just expression, period. And that would be emphasis on the individualism. And it talks about a glorification of all past and nature. So nature, we'll leave that alone for now. But a glorification of the past is definitely something I struggle with. This is one of those things where I'm like, this is not a good thing. This is something that I have struggled with a lot because I have very sometimes strong, passionate relationships with people, or ideas, or situations, or whatever, and it's sometimes really difficult to let go of those things for me, and moving on from things sometimes is easier than others, but I mean, glorification of the past as having this romantic ideal of not only future scenarios, but again, glorifying some of these past scenarios, which is not good. For the most part, at least the way that it manifests in me, glorifying past issues is not necessarily something I want to be doing, or past, incidences, or this or that, or whatever. And again, it's very situational. It's not like it's, oh, I really want to glorify the times that whatever ended up in just not good things, but then, oh, I learned something from it, and whatever. But glorification of the past, that also leads to the term regret and having regrets, and I believe that you kind of can't have one without the other, and I definitely am a person who believes in like regrets and wishing that I did things differently, but I also believe that I can learn from all these past experiences that may not have been good, that I can appreciate the fact that I wouldn't be the person I am necessarily without having those bad experiences, or these things that I regret. But there's some things that I definitely wish I could change, because I just believe I would have been a better person had I made a different decision, not a worse person, or better than who I am now anyway. So that kind of ties in as well. So another one. The movement emphasized intense emotion as an authentic source of aesthetic experience, placing new emphasis on such emotions as apprehension, horror, and terror, and awe. So, what I want to focus on there is this thing about placing new emphasis on such emotions as apprehension, horror, terror, and awe. And apprehension, I would definitely, the context that I've always heard that word and become used to it is not just fear or horror and terror, but being apprehensive to do something. I think it's rooted in I'm kind of I don't really I don't know if I should do that right now, or I'm kind of cautious. I guess it's not necessarily just an outright terror and fear, but definitely rooted in a fear for sure. So apprehension is definitely something that I feel a lot of the time, but this feeds into that feeling in and of itself, the emotion of it, then usually gets extracted and overanalyzed into why am I feeling that, and then the logic and reasoning starts to come in and it's like, yeah, of course, I'm apprehensive to do that because this and this and this and this might happen, and I want to be prepared, and blah, 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 blah. So that's a thing. But then it talks about awe, too. It's like the movement emphasized intense emotion as an authentic source of aesthetic experience. That's its own thing, and I think that stands by itself. But then it says placing new emphasis on things like horror, terror, apprehension, and awe, and having this emotion of awe is something that I guess I definitely feel, and I equate it to almost like a certain type of arousal as being like in awe of something without having the proper vocabulary necessarily to always describe how you feel, and in that moment of like, wow, like this is, and it's usually a very positive thing, but not all the time. I feel like that is definitely something that fits in the realm of romanticism. And there's a little short quote here: "The artist's feeling is his law," and I very much feel that. I'm going to expand on that in a minute. So Wordsworth, the writer-poet William Wordsworth, said, "Poetry should begin as spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, which the poet then recollects in tranquility, evoking a new but corresponding emotion. The poet can then mold it into art." So, huge thing here, which helped me understand maybe why I am drawn to certain areas of art more than others. And again, just if I want to put myself under this umbrella of a romantic, and that I'm not going to get into all the ways, but like I said earlier on, I was alluding to the fact that some of these like labels and whatever else, interpretations of that word and context that have nothing to do with romantic movement, I definitely feel like a draw to optimism and belief in romantic love, and that it has a certain importance in my life. So, anyway, Wordsworth. Poetry should begin as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Poetry, just substitute that for art. I mean, any type of art, right? And that's not to take away from art that is more constructed in a different way, that begins maybe in a different way, or is just more constructed in general. I would give the example of printmaking, because I believe it's just beautiful work that can happen with that, and I still believe that it is art. I don't feel like it falls under the definition of art just by that medium alone. It has to do with more intention and purpose and concept. But if he's saying that it should begin a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, I can definitely relate to that. And this might be another reason as to why I love painting abstract so much, because generally the beginning of this is feeling, is maybe not always a powerful overflowing, but it is what I am feeling right now. Spontaneous meaning right now. Like I'm not, if I were to plan, I can't plan how to feel later, right? I can't plan to do a certain thing in a certain way and also have it be spontaneous of how I'm feeling now. The act of painting isn't necessarily spontaneous, where all of a sudden I'm like, I need to paint right now, and then all of a sudden I'm in my studio, like I just teleported there. No, I plan to get some painting done that day, but the emotions and all that stuff, I can't plan those. That has to do with the very much in the now, which is in a way spontaneous. So, yes, that I felt like was like, yep, that makes complete sense. I understand why this was selected to represent the Romantic movement. I understand. I feel like this is why at this time they're thinking like this is like all art should be this, right? And we've come a long way since then, and feel like there's lots of different types of art and lots of different types of artists and whatever. But this was like the pinnacle of like, if you don't feel this way, you're just not an artist. Like if you are not a romantic, you aren't an artist. When we're going through these new schools of thought and ideals, right? And this is still something I idealize a lot, and has happened to, like I said, I feel like it's just ingrained in me, in my nature. But there's another huge quote here I really want to talk about by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. A new and restless spirit, seeking violently to burst through old and cramping forms, a nervous preoccupation with perpetually changing inner states of consciousness, a longing for the unbounded and the indefinable, for perpetual movement and change, an effort to return to the forgotten sources of life, a passionate effort at self-assertion, both individual and collective, a search after means of expressing an unappeasable yearning for unattainable goals. So that's big, and there's not a lot to necessarily go through, because some of it, I think, again, speaks for itself. Restless spirit, seeking violently to burst through old, cramping forms. I definitely feel that a lot of the time, the restless spirit really feels like, okay, that's just another word for anxiety. Like the way that it manifests within me anyway, it's like, yep, that's anxiety right there, this restless spirit, but put into an art context of wanting to, or not just an art context, but just like a self-reflection and wanting to, it goes on to, again, another word for anxiety, nervous preoccupation with perpetually changing inner states of consciousness. So lifelong learning, to me, like, it's, people have that desire with in different ways. It's not always anxious, or nervous preoccupation or restless spirit. Sometimes it's much more measured and calm and calculated and whatever, just being like, yeah, I want to learn this thing and I really feel like I want to be a better person or whatever, but the way that it manifests in me is much more of this anxious thing inside of me that wants to be better, to explore myself, to figure myself out. Longing for the unbounded and indefinable. So those are things that, like, I'm trying to constantly figure things out that just I'm not able to necessarily figure out. This is part of that maybe philosophical part of me that, like, some of those things are not things we can ever know, but that doesn't mean that they're not worth exploring. An effort to return to the forgotten sources of life, a passionate effort at self-assertion, both individual and collective. A search after means of expressing an unappeasable yearning for unattainable goals. Unattainable goals in this context, I would say, is like, when do you don't stop learning, right? You never stop learning. That's not, you can't just be finished with learning. That's not a goal. That's like, I am done the learnings now. Like, that is a goal that you can just attain, or like, I am done working on myself. I am perfect now. Those are things that you're not going to reach. And so, again, there's a lot of ways people can interpret these as pros and cons with romanticism, depending on how extreme you get as well, or how much focus or an emphasis you put on that in your life. And I definitely see how things could be too focused in that area without enough balance of things like logic and reasoning and whatever else. The last thing is my favorite kind of definition or a phrase to attach to romanticism, and it was from actually the book Romanticism, which, it's like a very short introduction book. If you know that series, a very short introduction to, and they have a bunch of different topics that you can go through. And this one was about romanticism and talked a lot about this movement. And I read it, and it took me a long time to get through it. But that was last year, and it didn't have. It was a lot more dry than I wanted it to be. It didn't have a lot that was really. It wasn't as rich as just honestly going through the Wikipedia article and the very first couple, sections of it were just more rich with stuff, whereas this book was like, a lot of it was just historical and in a way that I couldn't really grasp, or I didn't feel much from it. However, I made a painting that had this title and this definition. I don't remember who said it, but someone said that romanticism is just an abuse of adjectives, and I loved that. Um, One, the alliteration is just great, but and just that word, just abuse of adjectives. We're talking about romanticism, and we're talking about this contrast of words and this beautiful play of diction of like abuse. We're not usually thinking of as a good thing, right? And that's partially why I think they used it. An abuse of adjectives. That is romanticism. Romanticism maybe have built conflict right into it with trying to measure and balance things, because this just saying an abuse of adjectives and wanting. I mean, it's a technical thing too. I mean, they're talking about like writing, right? And so I'm just always describing, like, instead of just being matter of fact about, nouns and like people, places and things, and just being like, that's that thing. Well, just like, what's the word? Compulsion to over describe things. Like, this is why I was bad at essays in university and high school. I want to embellish my writing, and it's, a lot of people call it flowery writing. To me, that part of the creative is what's beautiful about writing. It's the art of writing. I don't want to just give you in this format that's very strict and whatever. I need to give you like very concise. This is what I learned from this thing. No, I want to describe what I learned in a beautiful way. Because if I learn something and whatever, it's like I'm adding to that knowledge with my own self and leaving you a part of me with it. That's what it should be, rather than I mean, how do you know that I wrote this versus anyone else if I can't give you my language, if I can't add to it? So this abuse of adjectives is really, that's a part of it. I feel like same thing if I am expressing love towards someone, and here's the other thing, there's cons to this immediately too, because if I am expressing distaste in a scenario, or I'm like, this is why it can be a bombardment of either thing for me in the way that I express myself, a bombardment of either insult, or love and affection, and that's something I'm trying to definitely work on in both contexts, because sometimes overwhelming affection isn't someone else's love language, so or just not a time or a place for it. Whereas for me, it's part of my love language. I feel like every love language is everything that could be a love language is something that I'm like, yeah, that's my love language. Like, that's how I receive and generally try to express love. But yeah, the opposite too is trying to balance. Like, I just need to be more concise and matter of fact, and to the point of, this is what happened. I don't like this thing that happened, and we need to fix that and figure it out and move on and move forward. It's difficult for me. Anyways. These are just my notes that I had on romanticism and being a romantic, and kind of learning more about myself under this umbrella of this movement and this, I guess, label of how a person could be, and realizing that, like, wow, like, if I were to say that in the future, which I don't know in what context now I would introduce myself to somebody as a romantic or whatever, or if it were being, someone describing me, I feel way more comfortable with it, knowing that I have all this knowledge to back it up in a different way than I had before, which is just the very elementary understanding of the values and ideals of a romantic, in the sense of relationships and love, or that type of romantic relationship, right? That you would maybe have with a partner. So anyway, that's a little more about me and why I am the way I am and who I am, and me trying to understand that about myself. So we will see you on another time.